It's no secret that things get weird when talking about space travel, from the development of rocket technology to the impossible. But did you know that underneath one of the primary American rocket launch facilities is an entire rubber bunker, accessible by a 200-foot-long slide designed for astronauts to escape a catastrophic event? Or that these days, it's basically abandoned? This is the story of NASA's secret rubber room. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Most of us know the basics of the space race's beginnings, but for reference, let's do a quick recap. On October the 4th, 1957, the USSR launched the small satellite Sputnik into orbit using a modified intercontinental ballistic missile. And from there, they kept their lead in space technology when they proceeded to launch a cosmonaut into low orbit in April of 1961. Though each of these accomplishments was followed quickly by an American equivalent, sometimes collecting even greater data on space and orbit. But the context of all this is really important, as back then, American people were confused, frightened, and often furious. So when a young, charismatic president, John F. Kennedy, addressed a joint session of Congress in May of 1961, he highlighted the urgent need for rapid improvements in America's rocketry program, publicly tasking the almost equally young National Aeronautics and Space Administration with practically no forewarning and no infrastructure in place to accomplish this consequential mission. Though the chosen launch site had always been in Florida, since, to cut a long explanation short, it's easier to launch aircraft nearer to the equator. NASA, however, had no permanent facilities there. In fact, until this address, they had been sharing joint facilities for testing military rocketry, which was problematic as Kennedy's open insistence that this be a civil endeavor meant that this state of affairs could not continue. On top of that, they needed a much larger rocket than anything anyone had ever built. The Cape Canaveral Air Force Station pads couldn't handle the size or weight. NASA duly moved rocket experts such as Warner von Buren from their previous base in Alabama and acquired a large plot of land on Merritt Island, just north of Cape Canaveral, beginning construction of the Space Center and Launch Complex 39 in 1962, formally naming it Kennedy Space Center after his tragic assassination the following year. Launch Complex 39 was originally intended to have 5 launch pads, 39A, B, C, D, and E. They would be spread out in a roughly circular arrangement, 2,700 meters apart from each other, to prevent the risk of damage during a failed launch. However, due to budgeting, only 2 pads were ever built, as building all 5 would have been considered redundant, unless the pads were consistently damaged or suffered from massive explosive failures. This challenged NASA's original method for constructing and launching vehicles, so they would build them initially in a semi-permanent but mobile structure on the launch pad, stacking the rocket and capsule components vertically. This meant previous launches were plagued with weather delays and technical faults. Not to mention, this was all slower than the Soviet system of assembling the rockets horizontally and then delivering them to the launch point by specialized rail carriages that would stand them up to the launch pad. The Soviet Transport Erector launcher could transport and stand up their crafts in a single day. NASA didn't use this method entirely, but continued building the rockets vertically in the central building and then moving them to the launch site on a gigantic tracked vehicle inspired by heavy mining equipment. It's also interesting to point out that the vehicle assembly building used for this at the time was the largest human-inhabited building on the planet. The first launch from Complex 39 was Apollo 8, which was fired off Pad 39A on the 21st of December, 1968, while the only launch from 39B would be Apollo 10, in what was the final rehearsal for the ultimate goal of landing on the moon. 39A was already being prepared for Flight 11, so the pad could finally successfully see through its role as a backup. All of these facilities were built for the same ship, the Saturn V rocket. At their largest point, these rockets were 111 meters tall and 10 meters wide, making them the core of the Apollo program, as something bigger would be needed to carry all those tools and spacecraft necessary for a moon landing without them. Running on kerosene and liquid hydrogen for its 3 launch sections, the Saturn VS contained a potential 42 terajoules of explosive force. That's about 2/3 of the explosive energy of the Little Boy atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August of 1945. When the launches were adequately controlled, there was no issue, and this force was more than sufficient to launch to the moon for the landing mission. Still, if something went wrong, if there was even a gradual fuel leak from the liquid hydrogen tanks, the entire structure of the launch pad would be destroyed instantly. So, to avoid this type of disaster and learn from some previous mistakes, NASA had to prepare proper emergency facilities for the astronauts and tower crew. In other words, they needed an underground water bunker accessible by a massive slide. You can still travel to Cape Canaveral and see the pads during launches or tours. You can even see them on televised launches for SpaceX, as the NASA pads have been repurposed. But what people don't see when they're watching these launches is the maze of underground tunnels and bunkers built directly beneath the pads out of a utility of caution. The astronauts and ground crews had to be trained in safety and countermeasures for failure, which NASA learned all too late after numerous failed launches, including, most tragically, the fire inside the command capsule of Apollo 1. Following that tragedy and the inauguration of Complex 39, crews were thoroughly trained for failure. The protocol was simple: leave the capsule, descend under the launch pad via elevator, exit the elevator at the mobile launcher vehicle's A-dock, and make a break for the emergency exit leading to a bunker buried under 12 feet of concrete. This exit was a 60-meter rubber slide connecting the primary vehicle to the bunker. Astronauts and ground crew would use an emergency sprinkler at the top of the slide to gain momentum, or for lack of better words, they turned it into a water slide so that they could enter the emergency bunker in a final chamber much faster. This was the rubber room. It earned that name for the thick rubber walls on each side to cushion the crew on the slide and absorb the shocks of the explosion. To ease and accommodate the crew's escape, the bottom of the slide in the room was flat and offered a few meters of material meant to slow the escapees down before they would hit a wall. However, since water could actually accumulate at the bottom of the slide during testing and drills, things did not always work as expected, as at times, men would actually hit the wall on the far side of the pad. On the left side, coming down from the slide, was a 6-inch thick steel door surrounded by rubber walls and thicker steel-reinforced concrete. This was attached to a round room with seating for 20 workers or astronauts under a domed ceiling. Under the floor were 20 massive springs to absorb the shock of any explosion, and the crew was strapped into further shock-absorbing chairs. If these weren't enough, fire blankets and other emergency items were in the bunker to keep the 20 men alive for up to 24 hours until help could arrive from the surface. Once the fires and explosive pressure were gone, the crew could escape through a hatch or a 365-meter tunnel leading away from the launch pad to a recovery point. If the further tunnel were blocked, they would exit the bunker tunnels in a climate-controlled building directly underneath the launch pad. If somehow both routes were blocked, there was a hatch in the middle of the dome that wouldn't lead to anything, but could be accessible by NASA in a matter of hours thanks to emergency digging equipment kept just by the command center. The bunker's shock-absorbing springs enabled it to withstand explosive pressure of up to 500 pounds per square inch, shockwaves up to 75 times the force of gravity. This amazing structure would also protect the astronauts from any fire above it, up to an estimated 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. However, if the damage was more substantial than the initial estimates, the bunker was prepared for that too. If necessary, a carbon dioxide scrubber would keep the air fresh for longer. Still, if that wasn't enough or if it had somehow been damaged, the bunker included specially designed candles that could extend the oxygen supply by burning a mixture of iron powder and sodium chloride. For every kilogram of powder, the candles could create 6 hours of breathable air per person. In the center, protected by a cage, were water and rations to keep the men fed until assistance could come. Meaning, according to some estimates, up to 20 men could stay in the bunker for 4 days with proper rationing. And if you're wondering, there was also a toilet in case it took longer than expected to reconnect with the surface. The rubber room was publicized during NASA's preparations and press briefings before and during Apollo launches, such as during one brief tour by BBC4 correspondent James Burke. But fortunately, despite this publicity, it never had to be used for a catastrophe. The closest it came was the Apollo 12 mission, which featured a very different character. You see, NASA's objective with Apollo 12 was to seem more relaxed, actively. The crew even packed hammocks to deploy at their landing site on the moon. Ultimately, the launch was delayed so President Richard Nixon could attend in person. Now that being said, despite how relaxed it appeared, the mission had many obstacles due to the added delays. For example, on the chosen launch day of November the 14th, 1969, there was only a favorable launch window of about 3 hours during stormy weather and an all-time high wind speed for the program. Despite weather conditions well beyond NASA protocols, the launch went ahead, and Apollo 12 was immediately struck by lightning on ascent twice. The master alarm went off, and the flight crew and the ground control were shocked as they tried to find a solution. The first strike fried the power in the inertial guidance system, causing the telemetry and other necessary readings to go haywire at the flight's most critical and dangerous part. Thankfully, they could reconnect it to auxiliary power during the initial ascent and eventually reconnect the power while operating under 4 Gs of force. And this heroic action was what allowed the mission to continue. Although this example of disaster was the closest an Apollo mission would come to on takeoff, the accomplishment was largely forgotten. The Apollo missions accomplished Kennedy's goal of getting America to the moon. Still, eventually, the public became bored with the launches, only regaining interest when it was obvious something had gone wrong, such as Apollo 13. Despite the massive accomplishments against overwhelming natural and cosmic conditions, the scientists were only beginning to unpack. 6 successful landings were accomplished from 1969 to 1972. Most passed into obscurity as public interest dried up along with congressional funding. And indeed, as nothing lasts forever, when astronauts David Scott and James Irwin landed on the Apollo 15 mission on August 1st, 1972, they left behind an aluminum plaque engraved with the names of the 14 men who died in the pursuit of man's arrival to the moon, 9 American and 5 Soviet. Hence, when the Apollo program ended, so did any use for the rubber rooms and emergency bunkers, and they faded fast. Without regular maintenance, they were consumed by natural flooding and left unseen by human eyes until they were revitalized during the Space Shuttle program. However, the shuttles used a different escape method, and the rubber rooms weren't even used for drills. NASA and the Park Service officially designated them as historical sites. Still, they are incredibly difficult to see, especially since flooding in 39B damaged the bunker's lead paint, which had begun to peel off and contaminate the air of the main chamber. 39A didn't use lead paint, so it's still accessible, but only under heavy restriction, as the pads are now leased out for SpaceX launches. So, although they were brilliantly designed and are some of the most technically impressive bunkers on the lower East Coast, their time as valuable instruments for space travel is over. Improved rockets and safety techniques have moved beyond them, as things in life eventually always do. Fortunately these days, space flight accidents are now rarer than ever. Nonetheless, it's a shame that these aren't better documented or easier to see today, so we're going to leave it there. But I thank you all for watching. I really hope you'll hit subscribe, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.